There are a lot of beliefs and practices that make Mormonism truly unique in the religious world. Certainly, if you take any person off the street, just a run-of-the-mill person, and ask them what makes Mormonism unique and different, the first things out of their mouth that would be brought up is certainly plural marriage. But what if a sectarian Christian wrote a book advocating for plural marriage? What would that look like? Well, today you're going to find out. Taylor Smith joins me on the podcast today as we break down a book entitled The Great Omission by Clyde L. Pilkington. Now, to cover this book, it is going to take 2 episodes. In this first episode, we cover the problem of demographics and ratio to men and women in modern society. Then we move on to Old Testament precedents, New Testament evidence, and what the New Testament and Christ really say about the topic of plural marriage. Now, all along the way, we debunk and dispel misconceptions around the practice and principle of plural marriage. Stick around for that and much, much more on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So a few weeks back, I told you about a new online merch store I was putting together and that I would let you know as soon as that was up and running. Well, after a few weeks of working on designs and testing it out personally, we're ready to launch. So if you go to MormonRenegade.com and click on the Renegade Supply button in the top right of the landing page, or click the link in this episode's show notes, you'll see that we have 16 items right now that you can choose from. We have shirts, hats, bags, cups, and water bottles, all with the Mormon Renegade logo, as well as a couple other designs that I think you'll find really funny. And maybe even one where I take a slight shot at BYU, but you should definitely go check that out. Now, this is just the beginning. In the coming weeks, more designs and styles will be available for purchase. Now, all the proceeds I get from this are going to go right back into the podcast. So head on over to MormonRenegade.com and press the Renegade Supply button, or click the link in this episode's show notes and get yours today. Taylor, what's going on, man?
Oh, not too much, bro. I just got 4 inches of snow this last night, so it's always an exciting first day of the winter officially kicking in.
Dude, I can't wait for it. I'm ready for I wish it'd snow 4 feet. I mean, I'm sorry to say that to you, but if it could shut down my cruise for a little while, I'd be happy. So,
Oh, right. I got you.
yep. So, but dude, when you brought up this doing a podcast on this, it was crazy how it all worked out. Cause like I just had Kimberly Watson Smith on the podcast last week to go over something very similar. And she did a great job. And then, like the week after Kimberly texts me, you text me and saying, hey, I want to go over this. And so it's crazy how it just all lines up. And so I'm super excited to dig into this. Real quick, why don't you fill everybody in on what we're going to talk about today?
So today we're going to talk about a book, and some other things, but the theme of the book, the title of the book is called The Great Omission. It's by a guy named Clyde Pilkington Jr. He is not a Mormon. He has no connection to Mormonism. He is I think, just evangelical type Christian background, and he became converted to plural marriage. Biblical marriage is how he phrases it, which I think is a great way to put it. And he wrote this book called The Great Omission, and he makes the case that Christianity's greatest sin of omission is polygamy and the aversion that we have as Christians to the practice of polygamy. But yeah, just the honorable nobility of righteous practice of plural marriage.
It was interesting because you gave me a copy of the book and you gave it to me right here before I moved. And so I haven't had a chance to dig into it yet, but as I was reading the back cover, man, he was explicit. I am not a Mormon, right? He was like, this is not my, not my faith tradition, so to speak. And he was really clear on that. So, and in talking to you a little bit about it, I'm excited to get going. So let's go ahead and fire this bad boy up.
Right on. So we'll just dive right in. The first thing Actually, there was two scriptures I wanted to share uh leading into this. And so basically the kind of part of the thing that has frustrated me with combating against the anti-polygamy crowd, the polygamy deniers, is that they tend, and we sometimes tend to let them, they tend to try to argue from the presumption that polygamy is wrong, and but there's accept and it's just wrong and it's bad, and then we're like, oh, but no, but God can command it and stuff. But it gives us a position of weakness. We're arguing from a position of weakness when we take that stance. And so my point is, there is nothing to apologize for. Polygamy is an honorable thing when practiced properly. And so we need to take the high ground. We need to argue from a position of strength. And in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, it says, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear." And I love that because it puts the responsibility upon us to prepare, because there's going to be people that question, there's going to be people that are antagonistic, but there's also going to be people who are sincere and interested in truth. But we just need to be prepared to give them the answers to these questions that are going to come up. And that is a responsibility that we have, and that's Peter, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. The other thing is this quote from John Taylor, which I've shared in previous conversations that we've had, but it's one of my like North Stars in my life. John Taylor said, "I believe it is good to investigate and prove all principles that come before me. Prove all things. Hold fast that which is good and reject that which is evil, no matter what guise it may come in." I think if we as Mormons hold principles that cannot be sustained by the scriptures and by good sound reason and philosophy, the quicker we part with them, the better, no matter who believes in them or who does not. In every principle presented to us, our first inquiry should be, is it true? Does it emanate from God? If he is its author, it can be sustained just as much as any other truth in natural philosophy. If false, it should be opposed and exposed just as much as any other error. Hence, upon all such matters, we wish to go back to first principles.
You know,
So,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
so I was just the point is, if there is anything flawed with this principle of plural marriage, we can't be afraid of that. We have to confront that. We have to explore it. And we can't just settle on, well, Joseph or Brigham said. Like that's pinning your light on somebody else, your testimony on someone else's sleeve. What we need to do is figure it out ourselves, to put in the work. And I just love how it's fearless. Like we have to have the courage that truth will stand on its own.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things you hit on, and it's something I've noticed, right? Not with everybody, but with a few folks, is from time to time there's almost kind of like an apology that's issued when someone asks us if we're practicing the principle, right? Now, and maybe it's just because I'm a little stubborn and I'm a little hard-headed, sometimes to a fault. But don't do that. Stand up. Wear that thing like a badge of honor. If you're a husband, claim both of your wives. The other thing I would say is that, also don't allow your wives to be beat down, right? That's not the thing we want here. If we want to have kind of a seat at the table, so to speak, if we want to fill the commission that Jesus gave us to be the salt of the earth, let him see. Let him see. Don't hide your light. And be a happy, healthy, functioning family in all respects in plural marriage, and don't apologize for it. Just be bold enough.
Exactly.
So,
There's nothing to apologize for. I mean, and as we will make the case, I hope we will prove that there is, just as it's honorable for a, say, 20-year-old young man who desires to prepare himself and is seeking for an honorable union with a woman to be married and start a family. Like that's noble, that's honorable, and society admires that. Well, until recently, society just universally admired such a thing. uh, but these things we need to just kind of reset the narrative and
Absolutely.
take this high ground, take this position of strength, arguing from because truth is truth.
Yeah.
So with that, let's dive into chapter one. And this one I might just read a few of these paragraphs. Feel free to stop. Let's discuss. But there's just so much data to back this up. One of the things that I have heard from not even just antagonistic people, but just people in the church that don't like polygamy, and it's kind of like, oh, they're trying to distance themselves from our history and the early doctrines and teachings, is but the birth rates, just as many boys are born as girls, and he addresses this in a perfect way. So
Taylor, I think your mic is slipping a little bit down your cheek there. Can you raise that back up just a touch?
yeah, how's that?
That's
Is that a
better.
little better?
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Chapter one, the sad ignored epidemic. I will get directly to the point. The problem that I will present to you is straightforward. There is a surplus of women. Are just simply more women than there are men. This has always been the case. This is a clear statistical fact across the board in every society, in every period of human history. According to the 2000 United States Census, and I haven't updated this, I pulled updated numbers, but as of 2000, there are 5.3 million more women in the United States than there are men.
5 million?
5.3 million.
Ooh.
Think of the serious implications of this fact. Where will these 5.3 million women find husbands who will love and cherish them? Let's consider a few brief words from others who have addressed this problem of the ratio between men and women. Philip von Hohenheim, who was a physician that lived in from 1493 to 1541, says, now it so happens that God has always created many more women than men, and he makes men die more readily than women, and he always lets the women survive and not the men. It's an interesting, astute observation from 500 years ago. James Stivers is a minister. He says, there are always more women available for marriage than men. In spite of the proximity of numerical equality at birth, the social reality has always been, for several reasons, that there are more marriageable women than men. War, disease, irresponsibility, homosexuality, vocation, selfishness, these are some of the reasons which produce the gap. Patricia Dixon is a professor and says, and all of these sources are in the book, chapter one. Males through all age stages of life span and across cultures die disproportionately more than females. Factors contributing to this are higher male infant mortality and premature death due to occupational hazards and warfare. Adriana Blank, who is an attorney, says, men manage to kill themselves off in record numbers.
Dude, that's so true. There is a website that I love. It's like or a Facebook page. It has something to do with like OSHA violations, and it just shows doing like stupid stuff, right? And like
Oh,
there's oftentimes I've watched that and I think back, I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely did some bonehead crap, right? I think it's
you're
just
talking about the guy that's just like cringing as these people as these machinery fail people.
yeah,
Okay,
yep.
yeah, I've seen that. It's like a Facebook page.
Yep. And dude, I've seen some stuff working, on construction sites. I've done it, right? I've been in some places I probably shouldn't have been. I think it's just kind of the price of admission of being a dude, right? Is that you're going to do some stupid stuff from time to time.
Hmm. Hmm. So, what nature does not take care of, men do to themselves. It isn't just global war that does it, although war makes a significant contribution. Men seem to have to war with their environment and with each other. Each and every year in the United States, more young men die on the highways than were killed during all of the Vietnam War. There are wars in the streets of our cities for control of drug traffic or gang territory. If males don't kill themselves on the streets or on the highways, they are engaged in high risk occupations. or they seek high-risk recreational activities. By the early years of the marriage selection process, we have reached that state where for every 100 females, at least 30 will never marry or will be the second wives of men who have been married before. These husbands often have other families to support, families that have been left behind.
Mm.
The problem is exacerbated. So that's the end of that quote. The problem is exacerbated as demonstrated by mortality rates shortly after birth. Within the first 28 days after birth, about 25% more males than females die. The higher ratio of male to female deaths continues throughout life. The factors involved in these different mortality figures obviously reflect inherent physiological sex differences.
Mm.
And that comes from an article from the Urban Institute, 1997, Improving Data on Male Fertility and Family Formation. So these are all like indisputable facts. And it makes a lot of sense. Like she was saying, girls aren't jumping off of 20-foot tall buildings off the roof and like climbing trees that they shouldn't have, they have no business climbing. I mean, girls are not doing these high risk activities that guys, or even young boys, tend to do.
Right.
And so all throughout life, females are also not pursuing careers as deep sea divers and soldiers general as often, or law enforcement, firefight, like all of these first responders. These are noble things, and yet they're incredibly dangerous
Yeah.
occupations to have. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, this is gold. There's more vital statistics. So continuing on with chapter 1, family therapist Audrey B. Chapman has written, quote, "Not all women are going to have mates, not even if every available man were willing to commit himself. I demonstrate this fact in my workshops by telling the women that if each of them stood up and asked one man all to herself, a quarter of the women would be left standing, as if in the adult version of musical chairs."
Wow.
Going back to attorney Adriana Blake, she says, "For every 100 single women of young marriageable age in the United States, there are fewer than 70 single men. As people age, the statistics get worse. By age 45, for every 100 available men, there are over 200 single women. When a society which insists on a one-to-one relationship in marriage finds itself with a large surplus of members of one sex, it behaves like a chemical mixture that has too many electrons. It is unstable, it is volatile, and it will seek to change to a state of equilibrium. The surplus of women does not go quietly into spinsterhood. Most single women do not choose to be content to accept spinsterhood as their place in society. Single women will respond to their biological needs, and they will continue to attempt to secure a man of their own. At present, the only way to procure equilibrium, that is to furnish a man for all those females struggling in the marriage race, is to maintain a system where men can readily discard one woman in order to be able to accommodate another. Our social system utilizes the only process available, that of easy divorce. There are too many single-parent homes, 12 million of them. There are too many homes where the father's absent, 10 million of them. There are too many children growing up without a father, 50% of them."
Holy cow.
That's the end of Adrian Blake. So he goes on, "This is not just a problem in the US. This is a natural phenomenon throughout all societies. Statistical work by Samuel Chapman shows that in his country of Great Britain, there is a surplus of 2,158,400 women, or over 9% of the female population above marriageable age. This works out at over 9% of all adult women who cannot marry in a monogamous society." His conclusions are that, quote, "A seemingly small excess of women can have a large effect on society."
Wow. Wow. So my question would be, do you think he takes into account, because there are some of this, right? When she says, or he says, excuse me, women of marriageable age, is he taking into account too maybe some women that don't want to get married? Is he just lumping all these stats in together? Because there
Correct.
are some other factors there too, right?
Absolutely. In fact, let's go into some of those other factors right now. because he makes the case that this problem is actually bigger than the statistics might first appear.
Wow.
Because, yes, there are 5.3 million more women in the United States, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. The situation is actually far worse than just those vital statistics might first suggest. When considering marriage, the real ratio between men and women must be seen through the filter of marriageable men. How many of the men are actually marriageable? The number of marriageable men are reduced by men who are incarcerated in prison, men who are homosexual. When taking into consideration these two factors alone, there could be as many as 14.9 million women in the US who will not be able to find a husband. But the real situation is even worse than that. The number of men is also reduced drastically by men who lack interest in being husbands, those who are not inclined to marriage, and men who are unsuitable for being responsible husbands, gang members, drug addicts, criminals, deadbeats, the mentally ill, etc. How is it even possible to estimate the number of men contained in these two groups? All totaled, we could easily be talking about many tens of millions of women who will not be able to find a husband. One author has suggested that this figure is close to 1/4 of the women, or 35.8 million. This is absolutely staggering because, I mean, you think about it, men are incarcerated at much higher rates than women on average. Like
Right.
the prison population is predominantly men. Gang members, predominantly men. All I mean, generally, there are more women who want marriage and want
Right.
to have a family and have children than men. I mean, you know, even if we don't look at it across the entire segment of society, certainly within Mormonism, there are
Dude,
more women inclined to marriage than men.
dude, you're not kidding. It was probably a year before I left Utah. The Tribune of all places had published an article where it had talked about this just within the LDS church, right? That there were more women seeking to get married than there were men seeking to be married. And also the quality of guy who's available and single, they weren't making any efforts. They were still hanging out in mom's basement, doing that sort of thing, right? And it made me kind of, shouldn't say giggle, but I kind of, sarcastically went, "Oh, if only there was something the Lord revealed to help this out." But it is a problem, and it doesn't seem to be a problem that's getting any better anytime soon, right?
Mhm.
I think even our laws enable some of this, right? I remember when Obama care came out and kids could stay on your insurance till they were like 25, 26, right? I mean, it seems like and this has been a crisis for a while in Western society, especially America, where childhood is being extended while adulthood is being shortened, right? And that is an issue for sure. And it comes with a lot of different social ills and that sort of thing.
Totally. So that Tribune article was based off of some work by a sociologist guy down in Florida, who I happen to know. He was in my ward growing up as a kid. His name's Ryan Cragen, and yeah, he's an
Wow.
anti-Mormon, sadly. But he's yeah. So basically, he he wrote he did some groundbreaking research on the dating crisis, and it was he initially published it in a journal in Florida, but then he got published by Time. And so if you go to time.com/datonomics, this is an article about Ryan Cragen's work. And I actually wrote an article for our friends, the Ericksons, Joshua's blog. Charlotte asked me years ago to write this. And so if you go to speakingofpolygamy.com and search for Datonomics, I've only written two articles, and we may actually touch on both of them today during this conversation. So but the point that is made in this is just based off purely the church's data. There are 3 single women for every 2 single men in the LDS
Mm,
church. And so that means that even if every guy in the church got their act together and got married and took that responsibility on, there would still be a third of the women in the LDS church left over. That's like that's 33% of the women not having a chance, even if all the men got it together. So this is actually, and what the point that I made, which goes further than what Dr. Cragen does, is I was just basically saying this is predictable. This is actually to be expected. Anytime you have a like a conservative value or a conservative like religious organization that values um, that values marriage within the group, like just not marrying outside of the group, and it encourages like large families. These are the types of factors that really play into this, and it it will produce a positive birth rate, like a
Right.
permanent positive birth rate, right? Well, what happens when you have a positive birth rate? You have more 5-year-olds than 6-year-olds on average. You have more 12-year-olds than 13-year-olds on average. You have more 18-year-olds than 22-year-olds. And the reason those numbers become very significant in this conversation is because women on average, there are of course exceptions, but on average marry older men and men marry younger women. And the reasons are kind of obvious because women, just biologically speaking, women crave security. They want to marry a guy that they know is going to be able to provide for them and take care of them and protect them, and that's generally older men are better prepared to care for a woman as a wife. Um, and men tend to marry the woman who will give him the healthiest children, like just strictly biologically speaking. Now, there are obviously amazing women who perhaps are unable to have healthy children or whatever. And I'm not taking it, but just on average, we're talking
Right.
about large groups that, and so the gap is historically about a 4-year gap. So in other words, women who get married at age 18 tend to marry 22-year-old men. Women who get married at age 20 tend to marry 24-year-old men. Well, the challenge with that is if there are more 18-year-olds than 22-year-olds, and the 22-year-old men are marrying 18-year-old women, what about the women who didn't marry at 18 and are now 22?
Right.
They have a reduced pool. And so this is an absolutely brutal crisis in the LDS church, which is why in recent years the narrative has changed from get married, have children to it's okay to be a single woman. You can still contribute to the kingdom of God and the church.
Which I totally believe, but that should not
Yeah,
be the ideal, right? I
correct.
I want to tell you something that happened to me when I left the LDS church, right? I was in a position of leadership. The stake presidency asked me to come in and have one last conversation. I'm not going to tell the gentleman's name or where he works. I will say it's an appendage of the church. And he was high enough up in that organization that um, he had like at least quarterly meetings with the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12. And I went in and I just basically, was like, hey, let's get this over with because I'm done. And the less time I'm here, the happier you're probably going to be. Right. Because I was
Right.
at a point of like, you're not going to like me hanging out. Now, this gentleman was very gracious. And I have no doubt he was very well intentioned. But he said, can I just ask you some questions about why you're leaving? And I was like, absolutely. And he's like, did you encounter some stuff from other members about the LGBTQ community? And I'm like, yeah, and that bugs me, but that's because we're getting too close, right? And as far as I'm concerned, we're not calling truth out, so that's not it. And he's like, oh, brother Sanders, you must have encountered some early teachings that are really troubling you. I was like, actually I did, but those aren't troubling me at all. And it was really about what was going on in the temple because they had just made a change at which they really changed a covenant that has to do with man and wife and the way God governs his family. And it's a covenant that happens from a woman to her husband. And I said, this is wrong. You changed this covenant. You've actually done damage now, right? You can no longer just say, hey, we just took out some liturgy that was repeated and some stuff that you could do some mental gymnastics around. This was the red line, right? And he said, oh, I can answer this for you, Brother Sanders. He says, the reason that the first presidency did that, I got to hear this from their mouth, was because for the first time ever, there was a lot more single people in the church than married people. We changed that covenant. And I just remember I looked at him and I said, so if somebody was having a problem with, not screwing around with the opposite sex, would you just take out the law of
Law of
chastity?
chastity.
And things got real quiet, right? But this is in that similar vein, right? Where
Yeah,
where
100.
where we're up against it. And in my opinion, the reason we're up against it from a purely population standpoint, more women to men, especially within a culture that values marriage and family so much, and we just threw the tools out the window, right? It's like you're going to, I don't know, it would be like me going to do a survey, and somewhere along the road I'm like, just throw out that survey equipment, right? Because we're not going to need it. Well, guess what? We need it, right? We're here. And
Yep.
so I find this very fascinating, but it does fit with an overall kind of narrative about, how we've let um modern day uh ideals come in, and it has upset some things.
Yeah. There's another thing, a last point I want to make, and I brought this out in the article, and time.com/Daytonomics covers it as well. So Mormonism is not this is not uniquely a problem of Mormonism, because there's other conservative, more like Orthodox,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, Hasidic Judaism. Now, the way Hasidic Judaism has addressed it, because you look back at the history of Judaism, and it was Rabbi Gershom, I want to say was the guy's name, that in somewhere around 1000 AD, or give or take, uh, basically made a proclamation, and the point was, we're going to temporarily stop practicing polygamy, as because I mean, Jews, that's part of the law of Moses. Like, they've been polygamous for thousands of years prior to that. But in 1000 AD, so just about 1,000 years ago, this, I believe it was Rabbi Gershom, said it is expedient for us to at least temporarily suspend this practice, because we it's inviting a lot more persecution, and so we need to kind of get these Gentiles off our backs. And so we're going to suspend this so that we can be prosperous, and then when we get kind of more stability and we get our feet under ourselves, then we can go back to this practice, and keeping the law as it's written in the Torah. And that was supposed to be temporary. It's never been lifted, because after that, the Jews actually began to prosper exceedingly. They became involved in basically all the central banks of Europe, and they became very influential in politics and finance, and so it just really changed that dynamic a lot. And so but Hasidic Judaism is still that very, very conservative kind of, fundamentalist type of, they're the Orthodox Jews,
Right.
as it's called. And so they noticed this trend, obviously, many years ago, and the way that they handled it was very different. Instead, because obviously the biblical solution is polygamy, right? If
Right.
there's too many women, good men will be willing, and good women will desire to be married and in a polygamous situation. The elephant in the room is that the LDS Church, you'd think, with all of this like historical doctrinal precedent that we have, that somebody would think of, oh, maybe if we just brought back polygamy, it would solve all of these issues, because it would literally solve all of these issues. But and it would still respect voluntary associations, like consensual marriage, rather than arranged marriage.
Right.
And so, yeah, I guess that was a little bit of a tangent, but
No, you're good. Let me ask this question. Does the author in the book dive into what come up as social ills by having a part of the population that's not marrying?
That's the very next section.
Oh,
Section.
well,
So
there you go.
let's continue. The problem of unmarried women. First, husbandless women, and second, fatherless children, widows and orphans, as the Bible identifies them. In every community, there are women without husbands. Single mothers abound, and for all intents and purposes, with fatherless children. Women and children without the loving headship of husbands and fathers are society's most tragic epidemic. Its devastating effects could only adequately be calculated by God Himself. The continual and surmounting devastation leaves untold heartbreak and scars, emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, and socially. It leaves an enduring path of destruction in its wake. Even sadder, it is an ignored epidemic. It is the scourge upon the human landscape to which Christendom gives little or no real recognition or attention. The effect of the deep scars that this tragedy has upon precious lives carries over from generation to generation without ever being addressed at its very root. Every social and religious attempt to address the issue is but a pitiful patch upon a profusely bleeding wound. None of this is meant to be an indictment against the sea of women and of women and children who find themselves in this immeasurable calamity. In fact, some of them have shown themselves to be the most courageous and incomprehensibly resilient in the bearing of their enormous burdens. Rather, these words are intended to be a wake-up call for those who profess to know God. This is a serious matter, and it is our responsibility to know and understand the root of this current social problem, and to make our individual attempts to correct the problem rather than patch its copious symptoms. What are some of the symptoms of the shortage of men? Women without headship, love, and marriage. Women who are forced into independent self-sufficiency. Children without fathers or without active fathers in their daily lives. Women and children who are forced into poverty, and he's got all these like statistics in the footnotes. Affairs, as women seek needed attention and love. Divorces caused by women who acquire a husband from a woman who already has one. Women who are forced to attempt to supply headship to each other in same-sex cohabitation. And women who are forced into sex slavery.
Mm.
These are just some of the symptoms of this surplus of women.
Right.
And it's kind of undeniable, honestly, when you think about it. Thomas Sabo is another guy who makes an observation regarding a character from a theatrical play that is more common than we would like to acknowledge. Now approaching 50, she realizes her only hope of loving a man resides in forbidden territory. In the eyes of the world, he's not much, but not much is better than nothing. It forces women to settle,
right,
for less than ideal partners. So, one of the specific and more obvious ways in which Western monogamy stands under judgment at present is in its neglect of sexual have-nots. A single woman over 40 years of age statistically stands a very poor chance of remarriage at present. Men are fewer in number, often marry younger women, and themselves die younger than women. If the wedding band is the price of admission to sexual fulfillment, we are creating a large class of sexual have-nots in women over 40. Women who might not willingly choose a celibate life. Particularly bizarre is the presumption of the church or state to have a moral basis for commanding monogamy in a population that is in imbalance, and where monogamy would ensure that some members of the community will be forced into involuntary celibacy. Anyone who cares about people should be concerned about this inhumane social phenomenon. And his final point in chapter 1, the situation is even worse for Christian women. Unmarried Christian women all over the world who have not yet found the godly husband who will love them as Christ loved the church and who can be a caring father to their children face some real problems. There is evidence to suggest that the uneven distribution of men and women is exaggerated within the church. This means that the problem is worse for Christian women than non. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that you should be able to get married if you want to. Sexual desire is natural and can only be properly fulfilled within marriage. But what is the use of being allowed to marry if you can't find a good Christian man? The danger is that you'll have to settle for less than what you were entitled to. So it's been the purpose of this chapter to merely present the problem. There are more women than there are men.
Wow. Yeah, no,
So,
and I can see that, right? Because if you're if you are a single woman within the church, you kind of are at a disadvantage there, because at least if you're a woman in the world, you can,
The
engage.
pool's a lot larger.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so this is a real problem, it sounds like, not just in Mormonism, but across all of Christendom, really.
Hmm. It is.
Fascinating.
Which is the point of this book, The Great Omission. This is not a Mormon book. This is
Right.
written by a Christian to Christians.
Interesting. Whew.
So, chapter 2, he doesn't waste any time. The divine provision, the solution from the benevolent God of Scripture. Kind of
Nice.
obvious. So, I have a couple of, we'll just highlight a few of these quotes. So this one is by a guy named James Campbell, who actually was a kind of a contemporary-ish of Joseph Smith, like, well, I guess more Brigham Young. This is something James Campbell wrote in 1869.
Who was James Campbell?
James Campbell was basically a courageous like preacher that
Okay.
just bucked the Roman pagan traditions of monogamy, of the Christianity of the 1800s, and was just like, no, we're just going to do what the Bible says. And so, I mean, he gets a lot of flack, obviously, but if you actually just read his work, uh, the guy's an undeniable genius, or just he's willing to stick to his principles. That doesn't mean that he always applied these principles correctly. I'm not saying that he didn't make some mistakes. Um, and and all of his ideas are great. But as far as I think his heart was in the right place. He was like looking at the Bible and looking around at the ills of society that he was encountering and being like, "Hey guys, we're in this boat because we're not doing what the Bible says, and we
Yep.
need to be a little more honest and less hypocritical about
All
this."
right.
So,
Nice. Taylor, I'm going to ask you to do a quick favor for me. That position that you're in right there, that's where the best sound quality right there is, where it's coming in. Like when you lean forward, for some reason your mic is muffling.
okay,
So sorry about that.
okay, I'll keep leaning forward then.
All right, perfect.
All right. There are would it be better if I just ditched the headset, do you think?
It might be. It might be. Let's
All
see if
right,
that works.
let's try this. How's that?
Oh, that's perfect.
All right, we'll just go for that. So this quote from James Campbell, 1869. There are very many persons, especially many women, who are neither married nor have an opportunity to marry. By some means, they have been deprived of their rights. The fault is not theirs. They would, in almost every instance, prefer wedded life if it were in their power to attain, but it is not. They possess the same susceptibilities of love, the same yearning for intimate companionship that others do, but these tender sensibilities they are obliged to repress. The fault is not in nature nor in the laws of God, but it is in the tyrannical laws and fashions of the artificial system of social life which now obtains among us. This system must be at fault, for it does not and cannot provide for the marriage of all. Many who desire to marry are forever deprived of husbands and homes, while the system of polygamy does provide for all, and is therefore the only system which is in harmony with divine and natural laws. This proposition is further demonstrated by the simple fact that the number of marriageable women always exceeds the number of marriageable men. As it is now, there is not a man for every woman, and either some women must remain unmarried and waste their sweetness on the desert air, and be entirely deprived of their birthright and denied all matrimonial advantages, or they may, several of them, agree to share those advantages in common with each other by having a single husband between them. Polygamy does not compel them to do this, it only permits them to do it in case they have no opportunity to do better. On the other hand, it does not compel a man to marry even one woman, much less to have more. But if the intensity of his passion urges him to such lengths that he must have and will have more than one, it requires him to take them honestly and honorably, and to support them, and to be a true husband to them.
Boom. And that's James Campbell.
James Campbell.
I don't know who James Campbell is exactly, other than what you just told me, but that dude's onto some stuff.
Yeah.
Well, and
And
he makes a darn good point there, right?
yeah,
In that he's almost advocating for what the book is, right? Not only should this be practiced, but you should practice this not with a sense of worldly pride, but not being ashamed, right? Not necessarily the presence of pride, but the absence of shame. And that
Exactly.
is something that quite frankly, if we're going to be change agents in the society, which I believe is a divine commission from the Savior, when he talks about being a light on the hill and not covering your light with a basket, being the salt to the earth, that's incumbent upon us to take the laws of God and be like, come at me, bro. Right? I mean, that's just where we got to be with it.
You just got to own it and
Yeah.
don't be a, what's it? Is it Timothy? I think it's like, be not thou therefore ashamed of the gospel of our Lord, or yeah. Anyway, it's something like that. It's basically God, for God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Be not thou therefore ashamed of the testimony of our Lord. Like
Right.
we can't apologize for our faith, our testimonies. This is really important. And
Yep.
we and the fear, I looked into it. The fear, be not God hath not given us the spirit of fear. There's different kind of ways to interpret that and understand that. And the way that the Greek, the word that it should have probably been translated into by the translators is not fear, but cowardice. God hath not given us a spirit of cowardice. And I see a lot of cowards going
Yeah.
around. Um, you
Yeah.
know,
Absolutely. And I want to be sensitive because I know that there's societal scars surrounding Mormon polygamy, right? Um,
right.
you know, having your kids taken away is not just traumatic. I mean, it is every parent's worst fear, right?
Yeah.
But I think we're living in a different time now. And I've said this for a while. We owe it to those who came before us, who kept this whole thing going for us, right? They did it in the shadows, they did it in the down low, they had to, but they kept it alive. And
Yes.
I'll just share a story here. When I first started the podcast, it was a lonely existence for a while, right? Because I had a lot of people from every single direction of Mormonism. Not everybody, but a lot who came out and said, "Don't do this. You're going to make our lives harder. Please don't do this." And I just kept, checking in with the Lord all the time. Is this what's going to happen? Am I wrong on this? What do I do here, God? And it was constantly, you just keep knocking the door. Just keep going. And it wasn't long after that a really old timer, someone who'd been down in the raids, came to me and said, "We I was skeptical when I first heard about this, but we're in a time now where I think all of us back then would have given our right arm to be in where we could talk about this so openly." And that's not something to for me to self-aggrandize myself with. It's just to illustrate that even some of our older progenitors are now understanding times have changed, right? The darkness has grown. That means our light has to shine brighter. And this is part of that light, right? I don't want to say it's the end all be all of the light we have to offer, but it's a part of it, right? And we have something to contribute to the brotherhood of man en masse because we understand this principle and we understand that it doesn't have to be a horror show. We just have to be willing to not be so secretive about it and come forward. And I understand that this may not apply to everybody because maybe they have a job that is sensitive to this, right? But at the same time, I think for a lot of us, the times are here now where we can let that light shine a little bit brighter and we can be those change agents in society that the Savior has asked us to be.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Just continuing on with this book. So, plural marriage allows women who love God and who are serious about the family values in the Bible an opportunity to marry good Christian men, men who are prepared to take a stand for family values, men who read the Bible, filled with the Spirit, looking to discover what God has to say to them instead of seeking to impose their thoughts on God, men offering today's Christian women the solution that has always been in the Bible, the solution the church forgot. Simply put, God's provision for the unmarried woman is marriage. 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 14. I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully.
Hmm.
And when you force a monogamy system, enforce a monogamy system, you are depriving these women of this opportunity. to obey the counsel of, I guess it's Paul. It's not like a thus saith the Lord, but still, I'd say that's good counsel. It's certainly canonical biblical counsel.
Well,
um,
it may not be thus saith the Lord from Paul, but it sure is in Doctrine and Covenants.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. So again, we have the advantage that the Christian
Right.
our
Yep.
Christian brothers don't.
Right.
Okay. Moving on, this is a really good point. This is a quote, a citation from that attorney, Adriana Blake. She says, "We must look at an alternative system that can solve the problem. This book presents the arguments for return to plural marriage as the solution to the problem of a shortage of marriageable men. What we propose is a revolution in our social structure for the benefit of women and children. Plural marriage is a system that is pro-family, pro-woman, and pro-child. If plural marriage were practiced, the rate of divorce would be decreased because divorce would no longer be necessary. Men would not have to abandon one wife to take another. If plural marriage were practiced, there would not be the unnatural phenomenon of single women competing for spouses. Women who wished to marry could do so. If plural marriage were practiced, fewer children would grow up in fatherless homes. The father would remain in the home, and the new woman in his life would augment the family rather than destroy it. It is time to return to the ancient custom of plural marriage, a social system which allows women to share a husband. It was a custom that provided that no woman had to live outside the mainstream of society. It was a custom that ensured that no woman lived alone unless by choice. It was a custom that protected women and children and sustained the family. It was a custom mentioned throughout the Old Testament. It is still practiced in many societies. Plural marriage is for the woman of whatever age who doesn't want to live alone, who wants to be a part of a family, who wants a man in her life. The alternative to plural marriage is overwork for the single parent, fatherless children, and loneliness."
Wow.
And
Whew.
I love this book because it completely reframes this whole conversation, right? Because this conversation is about, um, you know, most people, when they think of polygamy, they think it's about a guy having
Mhm.
multiple women. What this book makes the case for is that it's actually about providing an opportunity for every woman to be married who wants to be, to a good man, like not just have to settle.
Right.
Oh, um, and it's a highly honorable undertaking. Moving on, providing love, care, and headship for a woman in marriage is a highly honorable. Oh, I think I kind of alluded to this earlier. Uh, it's a highly honorable undertaking to be married as a man to take that responsibility to care for and provide leadership to his family. To expand this to an additional wife is indeed a most noble cause. Without a doubt, it should be the opportunity of every woman to be cherished and loved by a husband. When a young bachelor sets out to find a wife, he is regarded with admiration and respect from all around him, for the desire to become a family man is recognized to be one of virtue, a determination to embrace responsibility for others. But when the same young man, grown older and wiser, sets about to embrace responsibility for a second wife with her children, while maintaining his responsible roles in the lives of his first family, the world reviles him as a sexual pervert and a tyrant. Why is
Mm.
this? I have openly defended the plural family principle for more than 15 years and have often been accused of being immoral. Yet I am led to wonder, who is more immoral, the person who defends family relationships between men and women, or the ignorant accuser who seemingly cannot comprehend any polygamy, plural wives, is family. It is founded in liberty and bonded by that love which is expressed in the pure giving and receiving of self. We've all heard of instances where soldiers in the heat of battle sacrifice their lives to save comrades. Yet we do not need to die to obtain this state of existence. There is an even greater love than the supreme sacrifice of death. Which is greater, to die for others or to live for them? Think about it. To make the decision to give your life to save another's is instantaneous. There is no time to weigh two sides of the question. You act upon impulse, an impulse provided by love, by that energy within you that tells you that someone else is more important to you than you are. To give your life in the service of others is not so simple or instantaneous as to suffer death for them. Giving your life is an everyday decision, a decision recurring from every moment to every moment. It is not simply one gigantic gift. It is one gift, one sacrifice after another for the rest of your life. The celestial person does not simply sacrifice his life once. He makes the decision to throw himself on a grenade every day of his life.
Wow. Holy cow. Woo. See, and that goes back to something I thought of a lot, right? And he does a beautiful job of illustrating that. As dudes, we tend to look at the ultimate sacrifice as something that is the most noblest of noblest. And look,
Right.
there are certainly accounts of that where it definitely fulfills that criteria, right?
Oh
Um,
yeah, no question.
Men in wartime giving their lives for their brethren, right? Um, but a living sacrifice is something that continues, right? And as priesthood holders, now I'm going to switch to a more LDS perspective here for just a second. As priesthood holders, that's what we are, right? The priesthood isn't
So
something
it
that
should
we,
be.
yeah, it should be. It's not something we get simply for self-aggrandizement. We get the priesthood so that we can be that living sacrifice. So we can be the, as it were, the arms of the Savior in this world, right? And
Yep.
part of that is in family relationships, right? Our lives are not our own, and we have to learn to not just embrace that, but um relish that, right? Savor that. I remember, I think I've told this story on here before. The first time I lived plural marriage, when I had no idea what I was doing. Now I have a little idea, still not fantastic, but getting better.
Uh,
Um, I remember I was standing at my grill and I saw all the kids from Amber, my first wife, my second wife, her kids, all playing. I saw Amber and my other wife out there talking to each other and laughing and giggling. And the weirdest thought occurred to me in this moment. I haven't played golf in a year.
Want more from the Mormon Renegade podcast? Head over to the Mormon Renegade Rumble page to see all the videos from the podcast and the fundamental news program for free. Still not enough? Then join the Mormon Renegade Locals page by clicking the red join button, and for $5 a month, you can have access to podcast transcripts, Renegade exclusives, as well as weekly live stream show with the host Dave Sanders. Click the link in this episode's show notes today.
And the weirdest thought occurred to me in this moment. I haven't played golf in a year. Right? And now that's a weird thought, but you have to understand who I am. I'm hyper competitive, right? Always have been, probably always will be. It's just part of who I am, I think. And it takes a few minutes it takes a lot for me to keep that in check, right?
mhm.
And so I love to compete, right? And so I was at a stage in my life where I was done playing football. I wasn't, engaged in contact sports much anymore. I had got to that point where it was starting to hurt. And so I'd taken up golf because it was a way to release that.
Low impact.
Right. But in that moment, I was like, I haven't played golf in a year. Now, it wasn't like, crap, I haven't played golf in a year. It was like, I don't even miss it. I don't even miss it. Right. Because I had changed as an individual, and I had tasted that fruit of being a husband and father. And you can certainly get that by being a monogamist. I don't want to take that away. But there was something in me that had changed, right? I was now living a life of complete service. And in that service, there was a quiet joy
Hmm.
that I found nowhere else. Nowhere else. And I still had that same competitive fire, but it was with myself, right? It was like,
Right.
how can I be better? Right. And so I know it seems counterintuitive, as often the things of the Lord are, but you embrace that challenge and there's joy there. And I think that's something that needs to be brought out. This is not a miserable life, right? This is not a life where you're like, woe is me, I'm beating down, I don't have time to do anything else. Your values and your perspective absolutely change.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is probably a good time to cover another point I wanted to make, which was that, bad men make bad husbands.
Yep.
Good men make good husbands. Plurality has nothing to do with that. Like if you're a bad if you're a bad man, you could have one wife or 15 and you're going to suck at being a man at being a husband. If you are a good man, you know, you don't want to bite off more than you can chew, and you certainly need to be led by revelation in all things. But if you are a good man, you will be a good husband, whether you have one or five wives.
Right.
Like, it's not about that. It's we need to cultivate within ourselves a responsibility to be good men. And because good men make good husbands, and we need to raise our sons to be good men so that they can be good husbands. And if you're a good man who has mastered the ability to take care of a woman as a wife, emotional, not just temporally, but emotionally and spiritually, and all of these other areas of responsibility, then you have that opportunity to sacrifice even more and get even more blessings and experience even more joy, as you were describing in that experience. So yeah, I think that we just need to again just reframe this whole conversation.
Absolutely.
And because it's not really about polygamy, it's about how good are the men and women that are, because people, what is it called? Virtue signaling. People love to virtue signal. And if you're a
Mhm.
polygamist and they're a monogamous, we have a society that applauds the virtue signaling of, well, you're immoral, and therefore I don't have to listen to what you say or think. And so we need to get off of this obsession with virtue signaling and just do the work, just live a
Right.
good life and be a good husband. And then the other thing that you brought up just now, which I think is a really important point, you know, and sometimes, and I have seen this in plural families particularly, but I've seen it in monogamous. It's not a unique problem one way or the other, but sometimes we have this tendency to look at marriage as, a functional partnership.
Right.
And you need to be a functional partnership to have a good, successful, stable marriage. But it's much more than that. Like, it's not just about how functional the relationship and how, effective you are and at producing and raising good children. It's just as much. This is a love affair.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, eternal marriage should be an eternal love affair. I guarantee you, Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother are absolutely madly in love with one another.
Absolutely.
And that's how it should be. And so, like, we should, yes, we need to work on that functional, practical aspect of applying these principles and that. But we can't forget that marriage it should be at least a love affair. And our motivation shouldn't be, well, what will provide the most temporal comfort, what's the most practical thing to do. Like, those are not invalid, but they're so much less important than some of these other things that really we need to cultivate in. And I'm not just speaking to plural marriage. um it's all marriages. We need to fall back in love with each other over and over and over, because, like, if there wasn't love, like, just find a good roommate, and I guess it, marriages are intended to last for beyond this life. And you could have a very practical, functional marriage relationship in this life, but eternity is going to require so much more sacrifice and
Hmm.
repeated sacrifice. It's not just a one time; it's like an eternal sacrifice. And so we need to be prepared to do that. And I think that love is the answer. Love is that key.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, shall we keep going?
Absolutely. Well, yeah. This is great.
So uh this is a little repetitive, but I think it's worth doing reading a couple of these quotes. So, just speaking to the stability of plural marriages. Again, going to Adriana Blake. She says, there exists today in the United States a surplus of women. These women need to be accommodated in stable marriages and families. Plural marriages make sense because they would be more stable than monogamous marriages because they would be less susceptible to divorce. The single woman, in her search and need for a husband and father for her children, won't find it necessary to displace the present wife in order to secure her objective. Those men who do not treat women well will do without. She could leave, free to find a household that would welcome her. Going back to that physician Philip von Hohenheim from like 500 years ago. He says, God ordained that marriage be sacred, but he did not prescribe the number of wives, neither a high nor a low one. He commanded, thou shalt be faithful to thy marriage vow, thou shalt not break it. Now, it so happens that God has always created many more women than men, and he makes men die more readily than women, and he always lets the women survive and not the men. And if there is such a surplus of women, let it be taken care of by marriage, so that the meaning of God's commandment may be heeded. If this cannot be achieved by giving each man one wife, he should have two, or whatever number may be required to take care of the surplus. Hebrews 13, verse 4, marriage is honorable in all. And plural marriage is marriage.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. You said something that really strikes a chord with me. Plural marriage is marriage. I have a good friend. He's a good guy. He really is. He's kind of a he's kind of brash at times, but one day he cornered me and he said, all right, I want the details. What's it like to be living as a polygamist? And I said, all right, bro, come in here real close because I'm going to give you all the details. So he gets excited. He leans in and he goes, okay, well, what is it? I was like, it's like being married, but twice. And then I just left it alone. Right. But my point there was this, it's really probably kind of boring, right? To be honest with you, right? Like people thrive and they get off on like drama and they get off on the exotic and that sort of thing. If you saw my house, right? If people came into my home and watched how polygamy is here, and I'm only speaking for me, how plural marriage is, it's boring, dude. You're going to be so disappointed because it's nothing exotic. It's just a family, right? And it's marriage, right? But it requires, whether you have two or whether you have one, it requires that work, right? You have to nurture each one of those relationships.
Yep. Well, and I mean, let's be real honest, like there can be plenty of excitement in marriage.
Yep, absolutely.
You know. So, but yeah, it's if people are looking for like the juicy, you know, how would you even want to put it? Anyway, but I'm sure that's kind of what your friends want
Yep.
or expecting to hear. But yeah, it's just marriage. So, and your marriage is exciting as you make it.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
all right. There's plenty more. We got time. Okay. This is the next chapter, and this is diving into the marital gift of polygamy and basically like the organized religion's destruction of the biblical family. In Western society, we live under the hypocritical moral tyranny of forced monogamy by government, society, and religion. I say hypocritical because all of these systems are supportive of serial polygamy. All three of these, the government, society, and religion, will allow you to take another wife, provided that you be unfaithful and abandon your current one. Those are man's rules, however. And if you are faithful to your current wife, these systems will attempt to prohibit you from loving another woman and taking her to be your wife. These hypocritical systems will seek to punish faithfulness while rewarding unfaithfulness. If you will pursue a continued lifestyle of unfaithfulness and abandon each wife in succession, they would allow you to have as many wives as you care to have, all one at a time. But if you are an honorable and faithful man, you will be restricted to love, care for, cherish, and marry only one. They will seek to constrain the broadness of your heart. So much for morally righteous governments, societies, and religions.
Wow.
That's a good reframing.
Yeah, it is.
Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. And it's interesting when you consider that when you finally wake up and realize that it's not about one man, it's not about one true church and all the other churches, what do we have? We have a plurality of churches, which by Christ's own analogy means a plurality of marriages between the bridegroom and the bride.
Oh, that's an interesting point, right? That's something not even I have looked at it through that lens. But No, that similitude, I guess, is
Mhm.
yeah, that carries a little more weight concerning plural marriage than what I'd ever looked at before. That's fascinating.
If
Because
Christ is the bridegroom and the church is the bride, and we can get over this whole one true church, one man thing. Christ, even in the metaphorical sense, in that analogy, Christ is a polygamist.
right, right, absolutely.
And
Dude,
this next chapter talks about Old Testament scriptures and even Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament. Well, I'll just kind of spoil this. We'll get to it, but remember how when Jehovah is talking about his two wives,
yeah,
um, Ephraim and Judah, like or Israel, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and he's talking about, and they're both his wives. What does that make Jehovah?
a polygamist.
A polygamist. Now you can
Wow.
say that's only metaphorical, whatever, and dismiss,
Sure.
but why would you use an analogy if it was so inherently wicked and evil and immoral? Why would God use that analogy to
Right.
describe his relationship?
Absolutely. That's fascinating. Yeah, that's something I hadn't. Whew, that's good stuff.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, so chapter 4 talks about Old Testament scriptural precedent, and we're going to just read a couple of these paragraphs. So there is a great hush hush of Bible reading and study when it comes to some subjects. One of the greatest of them is the subject of a man having multiple wives. The Bible is literally filled with these accounts. They were a very common style of family life in biblical times. In fact, many of God's greatest servants were clearly presented as having multiple wives. Is polygamy a sin? I've asked many students of the scriptures about this, bringing the question into a modern setting. What would they do if they were in a society that openly allowed for multiple wives, say an African tribe? What if they were to lead a native man with many wives to trust in Christ? What would they instruct this new believer in Christ to do regarding his many wives? Would they instruct him to divorce and abandon all of his wives except the first one, along with all of their children? Would not such a requirement be absurd? Those Bible students with whom I have spoken have agreed that it would be ridiculous. The law of God given to Moses did not forbid multiple wives. The law did regulate almost every area of life, and having multiple wives was no exception. If having multiple wives was a sin, God would have forbidden it rather than giving laws for its honorable practice. Be assured that God has no problem communicating his disapproval of things he disapproves of. A man having multiple wives clearly is a social issue, not a sin issue. James Stivers, he wrote a book called Eros Made Sacred. He says, quote, in the Hebrew scriptures, we find both monogamy and polygamy as accepted and even expected forms of marriage. Commentators, embarrassed by the polygamy in the Bible, tried to mute the subject by insisting its practice was rare and abnormal. The record does not stand up to that assumption. Polygamy was a custom practiced extensively among God's people. Israelite society was a polygamous society. If polygamy is immoral at all, it is immoral always. If it happened only once in Scripture with God's approval, then we are dealing with an ethical system utterly foreign to modern moralism. Moral absolutes cannot have exceptions, or else they are not absolute. The regulation of polygamy is prominent in biblical law. Thus, we may interpret that fact as indicative of its pervasiveness as a social custom.
Hmm.
And then go through several of these Old Testament biblical figures who had multiple wives. It's just like you can't deny this. Abraham, Jacob, or Israel, the house of Israel would not exist if Jacob did not have
Right.
two wives and two concubines. Moses, Gideon. Okay, check this out. Gideon, Judges 8, verse 30, Gideon had many wives, and because Gideon had 70 sons of his body begotten.
Holy cow.
So 70 sons. This dude had 70 sons. And how is this possible? The verse answers it, the next sentence, or the next clause. For he had many wives.
Right. Wow. Holy cow.
Gideon was legit, like, so this actually maybe is a good foreshadowing for Jacob chapter 2, because Jacob chapter 2 condemns, and even even 132, like take this idea of many wives is is wrong, is bad, right? It's presented as being not right before God. Um, but what does that mean? Like, is it about the number?
No.
Because in Gideon's case, dude, this guy had many wives, 70 sons, and he was a champion
Yep.
of righteousness and for God. So like clearly it's not about the number. I think that the difference between Gideon and say David and Solomon has a lot to do with, they were the Solomon and David's case, they were being seduced by their wives, by the gods, like the pagan traditions of their wives, and so they
Right.
were whoring after the false gods. Whereas, Gideon obviously wasn't. And then the other thing is like marriages for political unions, for if it is, because just as monogamous can get married for lustful reasons, so can polygamous. That is not an ideal that God sustains. So like we need to be careful about, but many, I guess that my point is in Jacob chapter 2 in the Book of Mormon, which is the only scriptural anywhere that in any way, to any degree, condemns polygamy, and it's very limited to his audience anyway. We can go into that more later, but like many wives, it's not about the number. It's about are you incapable of meeting those wives' needs, not just temporally but spiritually, emotionally? Are you actually, like when you have 700 wives like Solomon did, like can you actually give them the children that they may feel inspired to bear? Like these are the types of things that I think that term many is about. It's not just about a number. Okay, Samuel, David, Solomon, Joash, and of course in David and Solomon's case, we know that they got off track and made some bad choices there. But yeah, okay, here it is. Ezekiel 23 verses 2 through 4. He's talking about the two sisters, Jerusalem, Samaria, the northern kingdom and southern kingdom. And he says, I was a husband unto them. Why would God use the analogy of multiple wives for himself if it were somehow sinful?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because there were different, I mean, there certainly could have been different similitudes given, right? A father and his children or something like that. But he goes out of his way to use the example of a husband and wives,
Yeah.
excuse me. That's fascinating. Something was said in there that I found absolutely fascinating that you read, where it talked about going into Africa or Native American tribes
Yes.
and saying, hey, are we going to require these guys just to part ways with their other wives? Well, the sad truth is that's been done both in Christendom and Mormonism as well, right? And that's something, whether you're a fan of polygamy or not, should kind of stick in your craw a little bit, right? Because what you've done now is you have dissolved families, right?
Yes.
And that's an issue, right? Whether you agree or disagree with the principle, to just go in and dissolve a family like that, I cringe at that, right? If we call Warren Jeffs out for doing that same crap, we have to call it out when it's on our side, right? And so that's something that I think we need to be cognizant of is that this is far more natural than people like to talk about. I have a good friend who I met while I was working back east, and then I also saw something on the History Channel about this, where they were kind of going. The History Channel did this thing of what societal collapse looks like, and this expert said what happens is that you'll see polygamy come back, right? Just a fact. If humankind is left alone, that's typically what happens. And because that is the case, as we go out into the world, especially a world that hasn't been raised with Western sensibility and ideals, we're going to see that. So that's a question we have to ask within ourselves. Now, for guys like you and I, it's no big deal, right? We'll baptize y'all and we'll seal y'all up and you're good, right? But for churches at large that adhere to that kind of Western point of view, right? That's something you gotta broach and you gotta tackle. And quite frankly, in my opinion, if that leads to you dissolving a family, you done screwed up, son. You gotta understand that this is kind of the default operating system for most of humanity throughout much of humanity's existence.
Yeah. So, in fact, he has an account of a conversation between a guy named Walter Trobisch and an African polygamous man named Omoto. Walter Trobisch states that Omoto's first wife was overburdened with work and wanted help. Therefore, she asked Omoto to become a polygamist. He concluded that it is strange that missions and churches in Africa have almost entirely overlooked the female motive for polygamy. There is justification for it. The African wife is overburdened. And so Walter, now this is the conversation. Walter asks, "Wasn't your first wife heartbroken when you took a second one?" Omoto looked at me almost with pity. "It was her happiest day," he said. "Tell me how that happened." "Well, one day after she had come home from the garden and had fetched wood and water, she was preparing the evening meal. Suddenly she turned to me and mocked me. She called me a poor man because I only had one wife. She pointed to our neighbor's wife, who could care for her children while the other wife prepared the food. "Poor man," Omoto repeated. "I can take a lot, but not that." And I had to admit she was right. She needed help. She had already picked out a second wife for me. They get along fine. It was a sacrifice, Omoto commented. Her father demanded a very high lobola, which is bride, like a dowry.
Right.
Omoto, speaking to the confused, so she was an 8-cow wife, I guess, in Mormon terms. Omoto, speaking of the confusion that the missionaries bring, says, "According to the church, my wives are considered obedient to God's will regarding marriage because each of them had only one husband. I, the husband and father, am the only sinner in our family. And you see," Omoto continued, "they are all praying for me that I might be saved from sin. But they don't agree from which sin I must be saved." "What do you mean?" "Well, the pastor prays that I may not continue to commit the sin of polygamy. Why, my wives pray that I will not commit the sin of divorce. I wonder whose prayers are heard first."
Wow.
"So your wives are afraid that you will become a Christian?" "They are afraid that I will become a church member. Let's put it that way. For me, there's a difference. You see, they can only have intimate relations with me as long as I do not belong to the church. The moment I become a church member, their marriage relations with me become sinful." "Wouldn't you like to become a church member?" "Don't lead me into temptation. How can I become a church member if it means to disobey Christ? The church forbids polygamy but demands divorce. How can I become a church member if I want to be a Christian? For me, there is only one way, to be a Christian without the church." "Have you ever talked with the pastor about that?" "He does not dare to talk to me because he knows as well as I do that some of his elders have a second wife secretly. The only difference between them and me is that I am honest and they are hypocrites." "Did a missionary ever talk to you?" "Yes, once. I told him that Europe and America have a successive form of polygamy, divorce, while we have a simultaneous polygamy. Ours is more honest, more humane, and that did it. That missionary never came back." "But tell me, why did you take a third wife?" I asked him while we were talking. "I did not take her. I inherited her and her children from my late brother. Actually, my older brother would have been next in line, but he is a church elder and not allowed to sin by giving security to a widow." I looked into his eyes. "Do you want to become a Christian?" "I am a Christian."
Dude, I've never met that dude, but I want to talk to that dude. That dude has it figured out. Holy
Yeah.
cow. Woo!
So yeah, that's Omoto, an African polygamist, and it's in chapter whatever that is, 7 or 8, something like that. So backing up a little bit, there was one I kind of just briefly mentioned, but I want to actually read the scriptures that describe this man. So Joash, you have to completely just ignore or pretend that the Old Testament isn't there to deny polygamy in the Old Testament, to say that there's anything sinful with polygamy after reading the Old Testament. And this is a perfect example. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verse 1, Joash takes the throne in Jerusalem at the age of 7 and reigned as a godly king for 40 years. The reason for this was that the priest Jehoiada had taken him under his wing. The scriptures say that he, quote, "did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest." That's verse 2. Interestingly, the one specific thing mentioned in the next verse about Jehoiada's godly influence over Joash was that he, as a proxy father, provided the king with two wives. And it was in this context that King Joash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. So there are laws, so not to say that the Bible is infallible. Like, we're not sola scriptura. That's not Mormonism, but you have to, as far as it's translated correctly, it is part of our religion. As we do believe the Bible to be the word of God as far as it is translated correctly. So you would have to prove that this was a translational error, which you cannot do. So in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 through 17, it says that plural marriage, there's regulations, and so that the children, to make sure the children of a plural wife were not like forgotten in the inheritance that they were legitimately entitled to. Okay, so this aspect of the law actually validated the equality of additional wives and their children. So although a wife might be second in the order of time, they were not secondary. That's what these regulations ensure, or are supposed to ensure.
And what
So
scriptures were those again? Because I'd like.
Deuteronomy, yeah, so there's several, but so Leviticus chapter 18 talks about a man should not marry his wife's sister unless his wife approves. A man was not to marry both a woman and her mother, as that would have presented confusing family ties. And this is presuming that you're going to be having children, because I mean, some of the early days of the church, and I'm not their judge. It's possible that maybe I don't believe that Joseph and Brigham were infallible. Maybe they did make some mistakes, but there are certainly records of plural sealings of like a woman and her daughter to the same man, which is actually forbidden in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 14. But if these were sealings for time, then problem solved, mystery solved. Like,
Right.
if you're not going to be children, then that's basically a moot point. Exodus chapter 21 tells that if a man marries an additional wife, he must not deprive the first wife of her food, clothing, and sexual pleasure. In other words, he has to be able to take care of a second wife before he should ever consider taking a second wife. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 through 17 is the one that was there. And then, of course, there's also the Levirate law. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 6 requires it passes away, because it doesn't say if the man's brother is single, then he takes his brother's widow and raises up children. No, the marital status of the brother is not even a consideration in the Levirate law, and therefore it would absolutely require polygamy in certain circumstances.
Right.
And then let's see, the second law of Deuteronomy 25 is much like the first. It requires a man who had sexual relations with an unbetrothed virgin to marry her.
Right.
So like in LDS terminology, that would be called fornication. Like if a married man has relations with an unmarried woman, the LDS church says that's adultery. The Bible says, no, that's just you're now responsible for another wife. Congratulations.
Right.
And so in neither of these laws are there exceptions given if the man is already married. So in other words, if that happened, the Bible requires polygamy, absolutely requires it. You can't get around it. One other thing, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5, it says that when a man has taken a new wife, and so this idea of a new wife, so like if a man gets married the first time, he's not marrying a new wife, right? He's marrying a wife. The word new is in contrast to old, obviously a reference to the taking of an additional wife. So the word new is translated fresh by the King James Version in Job chapter 29, verse 20. Chadash is the word in Hebrew. So Proverbs chapter 18, verse 22, whoso finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor of the Lord. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 22. So the principle of plural marriage is firmly established in the pages of the Hebrew Scriptures. Plural marriage was clearly God honored, just as monogamy was. God in his great love and wisdom has planned it this way. He's graciously furnished a marital answer for the surplus of women by making, establishing, and blessing the practice of men having more than one wife. Marriage is the union of a man and a woman. Polygamy is simply the duplication of that blessed act. Hebrews 13, verse 4, marriage is honorable in all. In God's economy, marrying an additional wife is marriage, and marriage is honorable in all. Matthew chapter 22, verse 29, Jesus answered and said unto them, you do err, not knowing the scriptures. It has been the purpose of this chapter to demonstrate that plural marriage is a scriptural precedent of Old Testament times.
Wow.
Okay, chapter 5, the New Testament, scriptural precedent. We must admit that the Bible nowhere directly condemns polygamy and nowhere directly affirms monogamy as the only legitimate marriage arrangement. Furthermore, polygamy is definitely not viewed in Scripture as sexual impurity. Contrary to church teaching and bold statements, anyway, he's got the sources here. Contrary to church teaching and bold statements that the New Testament corrects polygamy and makes monogamy the only possibility for humanity, there is not one statement in all the New Testament that says this. Let's go in. I mean, it's so good. Marriage system. I'm just going to keep reading if that's all right.
Yeah.
The marriage system of polygamy never formed a part of that ceremonial dispensation which was abrogated or ended by the New Testament, nor has it ever been proved that the New Testament was designed to effect any change in it. But the presumption is that this new dispensation has also left it as it found it, abiding still in force. If any change were to be made in an institution of such long standing confirmed by positive law, it could obviously be made only by equally positive and explicit ordinances or enactments of the gospel. Yet such enactments are wanting. Christ himself was altogether silent in respect to polygamy, not once alluding to it. Yet it was practiced at the time of his advent throughout Judea and Galilee, and in all the other countries of Asia and Africa, and without doubt by some of his own disciples. The book of the Acts is equally silent as the four Gospels are. No allusion to it is found in any of the sermons or instructions or discussions of the apostles and early saints recorded in that book. It was not because Jesus or the apostles dared not to condemn it, had they considered it sinful, that they did not speak of it. For Jesus hesitated not to denounce the sins of hypocrisy, covetousness, and adultery, and even to alter and amend apparently the ancient laws respecting divorce and retaliation. But he never once rebuked them for their polygamy, nor instituted any chain system. This uniform silence, so far as it implies anything, implies approval. So let's look at the historical period of the earthly life of Christ. Raymond Lawrence Jr. Writes, Josephus, writing in the 1st century, tells his Roman readers of the long-standing Jewish custom of marrying many wives. Christian scholarship especially has shown a tendency to wish away 1st century Palestinian polygamy. Eugene Hillman adds, in the Jewish communities of that time, however, polygamy was still practiced. Josephus, the Jewish historical writer of the 1st century, mentions in 2 places that this custom still existed among his people. The Lord certainly must have known that polygamy still existed amongst his Jewish contemporaries. If his teaching on marriage was intentionally incompatible with this immemorial custom, we might expect to find some clear statement of his against the permissiveness of the Mosaic law. We might expect to find at least a clear hint of disapproval in the one passage where Jesus actually discussed the practice of levirate marriage, Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 through 30. This practice frequently, perhaps even more often than not, involved polygamy. For marriage was so highly esteemed among the Jews that men as well as women normally married at an early age, usually just after puberty, and bachelors must have been very rare indeed. So it may be assumed that levirate marriages must very frequently have been polygamous. So Christ uses the analogy of if one, when he's talking to the Sadducees, right, about the resurrection, and if one husband dies, then the second. If the first brother dies, then the second brother is to take the widow, and the Sadducees were trying to make this like stupid argument about, well, if the resurrection's a thing, then it must not be able to be a thing because who's going to have this woman in the resurrection? And his answer is a mystery to a lot of Christians. We obviously understand that after the resurrection, men are not and women don't marry, but like the obvious answer answer is it's the first. Like if marriage is eternal. So we as Mormons, we have a unique perspective. It's gotten trendy in recent years, but go back to the 1830s and 40s, nobody was talking about eternal marriage. Like that was not a thing. And so that was a revolutionary kind of concept. And since one thing that we hold dear as Mormons, like what's the point of all of this work and sacrifice that we do in the temple and all these things if no, we're interested in having an eternal family, an eternal marriage relationship and eternal posterity and all that stuff. That's the point of Mormonism, right? At least it's
Absolutely
the main points for me and why I love Mormonism and believe it so dearly. It's because if this was not a commonly understood thing, then it makes sense that there would be maybe some debate about resurrection and a lack of understanding. And so the Christians reading it centuries later obviously may not have understood that either. And so it becomes this mystery. But from an LDS perspective, like one those of us who have the restoration, it's obvious. Like the first wife or the first brother is the one who will have that woman as his wife in eternity, because she was his wife, and the other brothers were just performing their Levirate duties.
Yep.
So, all right.
I want to take just a moment here and address a few things that you said there.
Please.
So there was a section there where you read where it talked about in ancient Israel, usually when someone became a teenager, they were getting ready to be married. Yes. I want to make it very clear, this book does not advocate for child brides. He says so like on the back cover, right? And I don't advocate for that. You do not do that. That is something that will absolutely do damage to people. And so I want to get that out of the way. This was simply explaining what the culture of the time was in Israel, right? And then there's doctrinal things and cultural things. And those cultural things we have to be very cognizant of and make sure that those cultural things that were acceptable due to short lifespans, those sorts of things, aren't being practiced today. Next, you make a great point there, and so does the author as you were reading him, about the fact that it wasn't necessarily ubiquitous, but it was way more common than what it is today, right? This idea of plural marriage. And so when you receive arguments from those on the other side, Michelle Brady Stone, you typically get this idea of, well, why isn't it mentioned more? My contention is that in the Old Testament it is absolutely mentioned a ton. And in the New Testament, look, there's kind of this thing in the news media where, I had a buddy who worked for a news station in Idaho, and he used to say, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Meaning that it's more sensational, right? And so if you have if kind of the norm is happy, healthy, well-functioning plural families, well, they're not going to mention it, right? It's a social given, right? And so in this case, not always.
There's a reason that TLC loves it when people it's drama, right? It's
absolutely. Absolutely. And in this case, it's not always can you fall back to this, but sometimes it applies, and I think it applies here, is that the absence of evidence can be evidence in and of itself, right? You have to be careful where you apply that, but I think in this argument, it's very strong in that direction.
Absolutely. So in that last point, the principle of the Levirate marriages did often require polygamy, and that was clearly practiced in Christ's day. Christ himself alludes to it, and that there's further evidence from the Lord himself that demonstrated the honorableness of the practice of plural marriages in his parable of the 10 virgins. In this teaching, 10 virgins awaited their bridegroom for marriage. Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 through 13. Paul also confirms the principle of plural marriage when writing to the Corinthians. He does so, in fact, by presenting a situation where God requires polygamy. Mark Hinkle, a national polygamy advocate, articulates this example well. So this is from a guy named Mark Hinkle. He asks, is polygamy commanded of God in the New Testament? There absolutely is an example in the Bible where God does command a situation of polygamy. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11, and also 27 and 28. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the Apostle Paul differentiates when he is making his own recommendation, see verses 6, 12, and 25, and when he is expressing the commandment of the Lord in verses 10 and 11. Indeed, in verses 10 and 11, Paul clarifies that the instruction in those two verses is, quote, the commandment of the Lord. It should therefore be noted that the other areas in which he clarifies as being only his recommendation cannot be used to otherwise and incorrectly assert that God himself is creating some sin or doctrine. After all, Paul's ultimate recommendation therein is celibacy. With that realized, it is clear for readers of the Bible that Paul makes it emphatically clear verses 10 and 11 are different. Namely, 10 and 11, in the exact way in which they are actually written, are the commandment of God. What do they say? And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she departs, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. The believing husband is commanded of God to not put away any wife and to let any departed wife return back to him. The key is that the husband is not given the same commandments of instruction. Okay? Only the wife is commanded to remain unmarried. The husband is not given that commandment. He's commanded of God to let her stay married in case she may come back later. He is commanded of God to let her be married to him either way. Accordingly, the husband is, of course, still free to marry another wife. Verses 27 and 28. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 27 and 28. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. So the Greek is clearly only addressing married men, whether or not the wife has departed. So as such, the married man whose wife is still with him does not sin when he marries another wife who is not another's wife. And likewise, the married man whose wife has departed from him, he also does not sin when he marries another wife who is not another man's wife. Herein comes the commandment of the Lord of polygamy, as in the following situation. Say a believing wife leaves her believing husband. She's commanded of God to remain unmarried, verses 10 through 11. Her husband, however, subsequently marries another wife who's a virgin, like not married to someone else, and not another man's wife. The husband and the new wife have not sinned, for verses 27 and 28. Let's say the first wife, the departed wife, then seeks to be reconciled to her husband. In that situation, verses 10 through 11 show the following instruction as the commandment of the Lord. The husband is commanded of God to let the departed wife be reconciled back to him. And he is commanded of God to not put away a wife, including the new wife. As such, verses 10 through 11 show that it is an outright commandment of the Lord to practice polygamy for that family in that situation. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 11 is indeed a commandment of God in the New Testament that when a previously departed believing wife returns, her believing husband and his new believing wife must let the previous wife be reconciled to her husband. So there truly is a commandment of the Lord for a situation of polygamy in the New Testament.
Wow. Let me ask you this, Taylor, because I think we got to give some context for this, right? Are we saying that a woman should never divorce her husband ever, no matter the situation?
No. There are instances, obviously, if there's abuse, I don't think that God is requiring women to never remarry and stay with an abusive husband, and like that's her eternal damnation, like punishment or whatever. I think that those things have to be governed by revelation. He gives a discourse that was not widely reported, but it's really talks about how it requires for a woman to be like, especially a woman sealed. We're not just talking about marriage in this context. We're talking about a sealing, right? And so let's say in a situation where somebody is sealed up by the priesthood and like the ordinance it's a priesthood ordinance, not just a consensual relationship in this context. And so, yeah, when that is the case, you know, there are additional criteria which must be met. Interestingly, Brigham Young talks about one of the criteria being that the man whom she remarries must have a higher priesthood than her first husband held.
Mm.
And so, like, because it's basically, and I'm not aware of like a revelation, thus saith the Lord, but that is what that's what Brigham established as the policy, and I believe he attributed it to Joseph, or at least like it was a collective decision, not like a unilateral Brigham said, thus saith Brigham. This was a policy that was guided by revelation, and it was established. It was not publicly talked about much, because then you have like just men. Well, who has higher priesthood? Who has the highest priest? And you know, he can go after the most wise. Like it's stupid. And so this was not a broadly understood or discussed topic in Brigham's day, but it's there. And so but yeah, like I'm not saying that there are no exceptions and that all women are condemned to suffer with a crappy husband for eternity. Like that's like the opposite of the point of polygamy. If you find yourself in a broken relationship, polygamy gives you the opportunity to get out of that abusive, dangerous situation and still have prospects. Because like here's the thing, there are a lot of women who get out of bad relationships, but especially if they got a couple of kids, like that's baggage. You know, it's way harder for that woman to remarry at that point. You know what I mean? And so so plural marriage actually protects a woman in that type of situation from getting totally screwed.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Absolutely. I just wanted to kind of broach that so that maybe people who aren't Mormon can kind of understand where we're coming from on that, right?
Yeah.
That those scriptures should never be used in a context of an abusive dirtbag to be able to look at his wife who he's abusing and be like, "You're stuck with me, babe. I ain't got nothing for you," right?
100.
And so I wanted to kind of get that out of the way. But it is interesting that the Lord is very clear on this. This is not the ideal of just getting divorced, right? And the Lord talks about reconciliation between those relationships quite frequently. And I'll just call it like I see it. Not in all circumstances, right? I want to be very clear on this. But most marriages that fail, quite frankly, from my perspective, and again, not all, but some, tend to be out of laziness more than anything else, right? I don't want to deal with you anymore. We're done. We're out. You know, it's too easy to have a divorce, in my opinion, in today's day and age. And we're seeing the social consequences of that kind of thing, where the Lord's standard is, hey, you work this out. You absolutely 100% work this out. And I think that has to be first and foremost. But likewise, I mean, its overall point, though, is that no, plural marriage is mentioned in the New Testament. It's just not as explicit. And we shouldn't expect it to be because it was so frequently practiced.
Well, and not only that, we probably don't have time today, but maybe if we have an extra conversation, there is history. Like there's some fascinating history about. So, for instance, what if the King James translators had a conflict of interest on this topic?
Yeah.
Is it possible that there could have been an impetus for bias against?
Right.
For instance, what if the man who commissioned the King James translators to do the King James translation, i.e., King James, was an avowed anti-polygamist?
Do we have history of that?
We got that. It's actually in this same book. I don't think we have time today, but
That's okay.
I want I want to finish up this thought because going on still in First Corinthians chapter 7, I want to address a couple other things, and that was a little bit of foreshadowing. But so, um, in the first part of the same chapter, First Corinthians 7, there's a verse that is sometimes used to oppose plural marriage. And the verse is verses 1 through 2. Now, concerning the things whereof you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. So there you have it, the objectors will say, and it does seem convincing, doesn't it? Let every man have his own wife. Yet, often things are not always as they first appear. It is true here, as this verse actually supports plural marriage. Before we obtain an explanation, let's first identify the actual words in question that Paul himself used in Greek. Let every man have his own auto wife, and let every woman have her own idios husband.
Mm.
You notice something very interesting? Did you see that the two words translated into our English version as own, the same English word, are actually two different Greek words altogether? The two words are hauto and idios. One is exclusive, the other is corporate.
Really?
Yes, sir. Tom Shipley, in his outstanding work, Man and Woman in Biblical Law, explains why use two different Greek words here for own in the two clauses of the same sentence, and what is the significance? Quite simply, the Greek word hauto, I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't speak Greek. That signifies exclusive possession. As, for example, I speak of my own body or my own soul. A biblical example of the use of hauto is where Paul admonishes a man to eat his own bread. The point being that we should not be sharing the bread. Like we don't eat other people's. The Greek word idios signifies actual or potential corporate possession. A biblical example of which is the passage which says that Jesus returned to his own idios country. There were others who lived in his own country because it was also their own country. Far from implying the unlawfulness of polygamy, the usage and signification of the two different terms here for own seems to have been employed precisely because of an awareness of the lawfulness of polygamy.
Wow.
Far from speaking in monogamous terms, it seems quite clear that Paul spoke in polygamous terms for the man, but not the woman.
Wow. Holy cow. That changes everything about that scripture. Because yeah, it's one that they like to use to beat you over the head with, right? If you're in favor of plural marriage. Whew.
So another biblical scholar, Don Milton, adds, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2 is a clear example of where the language of the Bible, in this case Greek, acknowledges that a man can have more than one wife. Had Paul wanted to push monogamy, he would have used the word idios for the husband and not hauto. This understanding of the difference in limitations upon women and men is important because single Christian women around the world are being denied husbands because of the false teaching that a man can only have one wife. The hardness of hearts and the bowing down to the golden calf of monogamy by married Christian men is depriving 2/3 of the women in the world of a godly husband.
Wow.
1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14. I will therefore that the younger widow marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. So widows should remarry. James Wesley Stivers writes, the Apostle Paul speaks to the widows the most worthy of charitable assistance. He did not advocate nunneries or houses for unwed mothers. He demanded marriage. Like other biblical laws, no consideration or exception is made for situations involving married men. What would happen should a church find itself with widows but no single men? Obedience to this command would require polygamy. We have here a New Testament application of the Levirate law. Christian men are to treat Christian women as sisters. If they are widowed, then they and their orphans should be adopted and incorporated into a family. If they are lawfully divorced, they are covenantally widowed and should be treated the same, as say the early fathers. This is the work of pure religion, undefiled, from James chapter 1, verse 27. Polygamy encourages this practice. Monogamy discourages it.
Wow. So if I'm not mistaken, that scripture and correct me if I'm wrong here. I want to make sure I'm understanding. In 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 2, maybe from the author and another author that he quotes, The more correct translation for that would be let every wife have her own husband and every man have his own wives. Would that be
Correct.
that would be
That would be a much more linguistically accurate translation.
oh
Yes.
man. And there we really see a testament to what Joseph said when he said we believe the Bible as long as it is translated correctly.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yep. Exactly.
Wow.
All right. I'm going to see if I can wrap up this section for today. I know we're coming up on time. So on forbidding to marry. Now this is from 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Now the Spirit speaks expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry. The unscriptural limiting of marriage to monogamy actually forbids the scriptural marriage of many Christian women. According to Paul, this sad and ungodly teaching is a doctrine of devils. Shame on Christendom for their arrogance and presumption to condemn what God has ordained, and I would add some branches of Mormonism, and for the tremendous repercussions of their godless teaching. Appropriately, Samuel Chapman shares these thoughts. We ought not to be surprised, then, if Christian women stumble into fornication, adultery, and marriages with the ungodly. Such stumbling is their own responsibility, but it is also the direct consequence of unscripturally forbidding polygyny. Hence, a Christian practicing the Apostle Paul's teaching must allow polygamy or live in danger of causing other Christians to stumble.
Ooh.
In Titus chapter 2, verses 3 through 5, there's a passage that can be seen with kind of renewed light when the divine plan of plural marriage is embraced. The aged women likewise, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. So, in all honesty, when and where is the apostles' admonition practiced? It has, for all intents and purposes, been completely abandoned. In what context could aged women have the time and circumstances to teach a younger woman to love their husbands as at home? The idea of the entire passage is that training younger women in domestic duties. Can one think of a better environment than in the daily living of our own homes? Of course, the word translated as women in this passage is the same word translated as wives.
Wow.
Read these words with this translation. The older wives teach the younger wives to love their husbands. Now, obviously, this could be fulfilled through various circumstances, but when scriptural plural marriage is taken into consideration here, one could hardly think of a better context. Plural marriage clearly also adds greater significance to the older women teaching the younger women to love their husbands. Proverbs 18:22, whoso finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor of the Lord. The principle of plural marriage is just as firmly established in the pages of the Greek scriptures as it is in the Hebrew Old Testament. Plural marriage has always clearly been God-honored. Marriage is honorable in all, Hebrews 13, verse 4. In the New Testament, just as in the Old Testament, marrying an additional wife is marriage, and marriage is honorable in all. It has been the purpose of this chapter to demonstrate that plural marriage is a scriptural precedent of New Testament times.
Man,
we're gonna have to do a part 2, Dave, because the next chapter is the religious system's destruction of the biblical family.
Dude, that's gonna be awesome. Let's set that up for next week, and we'll get that one out next week.
You bet.
Dude, I'll tell you what, one last thing I want to wrap up with here. Where it talks about there in the book about that system kind of setting the table for fornication and that sort of thing, that's a damning statement, right, to religious organizations that kind of forbid plural marriage, right? Because you may not have committed the act, and the act ultimately falls on the individual, but you certainly help set the table. And that's fascinating stuff. Dude, I know you're hard up against a break, so what we'll do is we'll pick this up next week. Great stuff as always, and I look forward to seeing you.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Talk to you soon.
Bye, everybody.